Okay, this will probably be a two-part movie.
Lynn Malcolm with you for All in the Mind. Today, the psychology of pedophilia. What do you remember about the man and the type of person that he appeared to be before you knew about these crimes that he was committing?
Yeah, he was a grumpy old man, but he didn't have to impress any of us or groom any of us. We'd take our children, drop them off safely, 5 days a week, pick them up, and he had access to them.
It seems like such a very powerful drive that he had to continue this abuse. Is there any degree to which you understand this behaviour?
No. We've experienced what it does. I can't possibly ever come to understand or comprehend how anyone at all can assault or abuse a young child. It's incomprehensible to us.
Anthony and Chrissy Foster. 2 of their 3 daughters, Emma and Katie, were sexually abused when they were in primary school by the late Melbourne Catholic priest, Father Kevin O'Donnell. Like the Fosters, many of us find the behaviour of child sex offenders difficult to understand, and especially if you've been a victim, deeply traumatic. Today's topic is not an easy one. We'll look at some of the efforts going on to try and understand the pedophilic mind in the hope that these damaging offences can be prevented in the future. Anthony and Chrissy Foster didn't find out about the abuse of their daughters until they were in their teens, but the effects were already being felt.
Emma seemed to turn all the anger she had back in on herself. She didn't feel as though she could tell us what had happened to her early on, and when she reached puberty, she just started taking it out on herself. And to see a child with blood pouring out of their wrist because they've attacked their wrist with a piece of glass, because that's the level of pain and anguish that's inside, it's just horrific.
And sadly, she took her own life. I think she was 25.
Yeah, she took her own life as a result of a legal medication overdose. So she was discharged from a Catholic church-run rehab institution, and the next day took all the medication that she'd been discharged with and died a short time later.
And with Kate, your other daughter, you found out later about her abuse.
Katie seemed to manage quite well, apart from being depressed, but she did turn to alcohol. That seemed to be her out. But then she went out to a friend's house and was drunk and ran across the road and got hit by a car. She actually died at the scene but was resuscitated, but there was a lot of damage done to her brain, and she still has 24-hour care. That was 15 years ago this month.
Chrissy and Anthony Foster continue to fight for justice for victims of child sexual assault through the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry and the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sex Abuse. There's no doubt that these offences can devastate people's lives. But to what extent do we understand what happens in the minds of the perpetrators? Well, this is the work of psychologist, senior scientist and associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, James Cantor. Does he think that the brains of child sex offenders differ from what we consider normal brains?
It certainly looks like there is, yes. There have been several different researchers. There's my own team in Toronto, and there are 3 teams in Germany that have been using MRIs to compare pedophiles with non-pedophiles. Although our findings are disagreeing a little bit over where in the brain pedophiles seem to be different from non-pedophiles, but all of us are finding significant differences between the 2 types.
You suggest that the difference is in the white matter of the brain rather than the grey matter. Can you explain what the significance of that is?
Sure. The grey matter are really the centers of the cell bodies of the actual neurons, where the tails that come off those cells are whitish in color. And when several of those nerves bundle together, they compose a tract, which then connects one part of the brain with another part of the brain. Gray matter damage, usually that's associated with the loss of some ability. But with white matter differences, it's a difference in the connectivity of the brain, of the ability of different parts of the brain to work together. So my own team's research, it was really the first time that we started seeing differences in white matter in the brains of pedophiles versus non-pedophilic individuals, which caused us to start to think in a very, very different way about how the brain might be creating pedophilia.
And so what are the implications of that?
When researchers like me and other teams started doing this work, there were really two major theories going on at the time. I just kind of nicknamed them the frontal lobe theorists and the temporal lobe theorists, just according to where in the brain they thought the differences were. The frontal lobe theorists depended on the part of the brain that controls inhibition, or decision-making, and self-control. So the frontal lobe theorists thought, well, pedophiles must be unable to control their sexual instincts towards children, therefore the problems must be in the front part of the brain. Personally, I never bought that theory very much. If I ask a regular, everyday person, how do you suppress your sexual interests in children, he'll look at me like I have three heads. There are no sexual interests in children for him to suppress, so I never really bought the frontal lobe theory. The temporal lobe theorists, deep inside the temporal lobes is where the lizard brain is. The very, very basic instincts to survival, including fighting, aggression, feeding, and of course sex. Now, because that's where sex was, that's where some researchers thought that they would find trouble. But when my team came in and we had an advantage that we had very, very large samples, which means we could take very detailed pictures of the brain, and what we found were no differences in the frontal lobes at all, and no differences in the temporal lobes at all. Instead, we found this difference in white matter, suggesting there was a difference in connectivity. So it struck me then that what might be going on is a literal cross-wiring in the brain. Humans and several of the other upper primates have very natural social instincts. When we see something aggressive, we automatically either aggress back or run away. When we see something sexy, we very naturally begin to flirt with it. When we see a child, it evokes very avuncular or parental or protective instincts. It's almost as if, and again I mean this only as an analogy, it's almost as if when a pedophile sees a child, instead of that stimulus automatically eliciting an avuncular or parental instinct, it's instead triggering the sexual instincts, as if these two parts of the brain are, quite literally, cross-wired. The wrong stimulus is eliciting the wrong response.
And what's the understanding about why this injury, if you like, occurs in the brain?
That's still a big mystery. There were a series of other studies that we were able to do on my team to help us nail down where in the timing of human development that things might have started to go different. One of the problems in doing this kind of research is when I get pedophiles who are willing to participate in research studies. Of course, they've already committed their crimes, they've already been in jail, they've already been released, and according to the ethics committees, that's when I'm allowed to approach them and ask if they're willing to participate in studies. But the brain develops, of course, long before any of these kinds of behaviors happen. So I had to ask questions about what was going on in their lives, sometimes 20 and 30 years before. And it turns out they were more likely to fail school grades, they were more likely to have suffered head injuries before age 13, but not after age 13, again giving me a clue that whatever went off started earlier in life. But the most important clue was one that was really very unexpected. They're 3 times as likely to be left-handed as they should be. Usually, regular everyday men, it's about 8 to 10% of normal guys, but about 33% of the pedophiles. Now, there's only one thing that determines a person's handedness, and that's brain organization. And it happens before birth. So the only way that there could be a difference in handedness among the pedophiles is if whatever the chain of events was, the first link of that chain also had to be before birth. So even though it's the brain imaging telling us where in the brain things went wrong, it's these other indirect studies that are beginning to give us a picture of when things went wrong, and it looks like it was before birth.
Is there also an explanation in the area of developmental psychology? I mean, what can you say about what happens in people's development that causes them a sexual attraction to children?
For a very, very long time, people believed in what we now nickname the abused abuser theory. It was basically the idea that being the victim of especially sexual abuse will make a person more likely to become a pedophile or become a child molester in adulthood. There doesn't seem to be much research to support that idea, however. The first major difference is, of course, practically all pedophiles are male, but the majority of the victims are female. If there was a very simple like makes like mechanism, we wouldn't see such a large sex difference between the victims and the perpetrators. The other big clue is that the association seems not to be specific to sex. Rather, it seems to be experiencing just about any kind of adversity in childhood, whether that's sexual abuse, physical or violent abuse, neglect. All of those seem to cause a great many kinds of problems later in life, including general criminality. So although the best evidence is that pedophilia seems to be in the brain and that's something that we're born with, the willingness to break the law seems to be something that's learned. So the pedophilia seems to be biological, but the willingness to break the law and to act on that pedophilia seems to be the result of early environment.
James Cantor from the University of Toronto. Professor Stephen Smallbone from the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University in Queensland has treated hundreds of child sex offenders. And he doesn't agree that pedophilia is a mental illness. He even takes exception to our use of the word pedophilia. He says that perhaps there are brain differences in some extreme cases, but the biological theory doesn't go far enough in explaining the problem.
It's based on this idea that sex offenders are different to me, they're different to everybody else. I think it's a faulty assumption to begin with. It's really the social rules that have changed, not the potential of sexual interest in children. If we take a broad perspective across human history, we see example after example after example of human societies where sexual contact with children has been normal. Human societies, up until recently, have regarded the onset of puberty and not the end of puberty as the signal for sexual maturity, if you like. 150 years ago, the age of consent in England was 10. So as a society, our concern about protecting children from sexual exploitation is a relatively new thing. There have always been incest taboos across human society, so it's pretty much always been considered by humans that it's not okay to have sexual contact with your own children or with related children. But the concerns about the sexual exploitation of other children is a relatively new thing. So if there's a biological element, it seems to me that it's more or less universal, because 150 years of social changes that have brought us to this very good point of protecting children from sexual exploitation is by no means long enough to have had a kind of an evolutionary or biological effect on humans.
For those people who don't have tendencies to be attracted to children, it is really, really difficult to understand, especially when you hear some of the more extreme accounts from victims. From your research, can you cast some light on why it occurs? Is it a matter of psychological development? Where does it go wrong when you get instances of behaviour and offence that really does cause a lot of damage?
Well, yes, it's, in my view, a kind of an unrestrained behaviour. People, I don't think, learn to be sexually interested in children. We learn not to be, by and large. So acting on a sexual interest in a child is really a failure of restraint, in my view.
And so what are some of the triggers for people to becoming a sex offender?
There is a curious link between early sexual victimisation and sexual offending. It's not a terribly strong link, but particularly for the most persistent offenders, it's quite common to find a history of sexual victimisation in their past. Now, this is not a direct link, but the early experience of sexual victimisation for some people, and particularly for some males, can provide them with a concrete kind of model of the behaviour that people who aren't abused aren't exposed to. So I think that's one issue. But I think the circumstances in which the very first incident of sexual abuse occurs is very important, and we know very little about that. Most of the research is based on observations of offenders, sometimes years after they've begun offending, and because our attention is often rightly directed to the most persistent and disturbed offenders, then we tend to generalise, I think, very unsafely and
I'm going to
erroneously
stop this at
generalise from the
15
worst
minutes
cases
and recommence
assume that
recording
this is somehow
to get
a
the
cause
second half of the
problem.
program.
I think we have to separate causes and consequences. Coming back to the term of pedophilia, it seems to me that if such a syndrome does exist, and I accept that it does, that I think it's an outcome of the offending behaviour, not an original cause necessarily.